All right. Welcome one, welcome all to today's webinar titled The Power of Alignment and Intrinsic Motivation and Continuous Improvement. I am your host, Clint Corley, joined by my esteemed colleague and presenter, Mark Graven. Mark, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Sure thing, Clint. Thanks for hosting today.
Anytime. So today's presenter, most people here probably already know him, Mark Graven. He's a senior advisor to KaiNexus. He is also the president of Constancy Incorporated and the author of a number of different books, namely Lean Hospitals, Healthcare Kaizen, Practicing Lean, and Measures of Success. With no further ado, Mark, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, Clint, thank you, and thank you to everybody for attending today. So I want to share some thoughts around motivation and alignment when it comes to continuous improvement, whether that's through lean or whatever methodology. I'm partial to lean and the Kaizen component of lean or the Toyota production system. But there's a really common question that comes up when organizations are learning about continuous improvement. In fact, I just got back from Japan yesterday, and so hopefully my energy level sounds good enough. I'm jet lagged, and I think I just gotten adjusted to Japan time. It's now middle of the night in Japan, so hopefully I don't sound like I feel like it's the middle of the night. But I'll tell you, even this question came up last week. We had somebody there from Singapore, and their healthcare system has been embracing lean and continuous improvement, and they asked this exact same question. And I don't fault anyone for asking the question, because again, it comes up like literally almost every time I'm helping introduce people to continuous improvement or Kaizen. This question or some form of it asks, should we give incentives or rewards for people's participation in Kaizen? Should we? Do we have to? Are there problems caused by this? These are some of the themes I'm going to talk about today. So people talk about, not just in this context, but in other ways, they talk about rewards and recognition. I always think it's interesting. Maybe it just sounds better. It rolls off the tongue instead of saying recognition and rewards. I don't know if that's really true, but maybe it's just our bias toward rewards. This is something that organizations of all types and all industries, I think, have tried to do as part of sort of traditional management approaches. And so then it's natural and unsurprising when lean or continuous improvement enters the picture that we're still thinking about incentivizing people. But again, last week in Japan, we went to Toyota, and the tour guide talked about Kaizen, of course, and they talk about what they call their creative suggestion system, I believe is the term. If I have that wrong, I'll blame jet lag again. But I think it's interesting. The word creative is definitely part of that. But the tour guide, I asked about, on behalf of the others attending, is there anything paid to you when you have an idea? And she said that, yeah, there's a minimum of 500 yen paid for ideas. There was another company we visited later in the week. It was a smaller manufacturing company, and they said, and I think this was across the board, that every idea that was implemented paid out 100 yen. Now, if you're not familiar with the exchange rate from yen to dollars, like 500 might sound like a lot, but when you lop off 2 zeros at the end, this is really just the equivalent of a Lincoln or a Washington. So I think it's interesting that, at least in these cases, these companies are giving small rewards. Sometimes organizations, and this was true back in the era of suggestion boxes, they would dabble or experiment with large rewards. And I'll come back to that point later around how this can sometimes get dysfunctional. But again, these small rewards, maybe it's a form of recognition. These small rewards are generally paid for what are relatively small ideas. This is something I blogged about back in 2014. You can find this article on my blog. When I toured the factory in 2014, I asked the tour guide if she had ever spoken up about a Kaizen idea. Did they listen to her, and what was the process? And one of the examples, and I sketched it out crudely here, you'll see I'm not an artist. They don't allow you to take pictures in the factory. But as we were walking along the mezzanine and the catwalk, going through the factory with the tours. There are different spots where the tour guide would stop and grab a microphone and talk to us about what was being illustrated in that part of the plant. And the Kaizen was that there was a metal hook attached to the railing at different points, because the tour guide has a bag that she carries along with her. And she said that this was a Kaizen idea. So something really simple, but in the spirit of Kaizen, this makes life a little bit easier for the tour guides. You know, the factory is clean, but if they don't want to set their nice bag on the ground, you know, having a hook is really not a bad thing to do, or not an expensive thing to consider implementing. So if you pay $5 for that idea, maybe that's not a bad form of recognition. It's something, it's a token reward. Now, this other manufacturing company that was giving 100 yen or $1, we were in the office area where they had, because you can see, for those of you who are KaiNexus users, you might cringe, but they had binders full of Kaizens, to use that phrase, binders full of Kaizens. And every sheet of paper in these binders is a single page before and after summary of different improvements that had been done. I don't have the exact count, but these are thick binders. There's lots of Kaizens here. And as they said in this factory, they were very specific and intentional when they said, when you look at all of this participation, they said, Kaizen is voluntary. And that's something I've heard from other organizations, and that's something I've tried to teach and advocate for. Because at this factory, they said that you know, they're afraid if they set a numerical target or quota, that wasn't necessarily driving the right behavior. So you can have an environment where Kaizen is voluntary and you have huge participation. So you might ask, well, what's their motivation? If they're just getting $1 or $2, what's their motivation for doing this? And if we go back and look at dictionary definitions of motivation, you know, motivation is a noun. Motivation exists. It's something that's there or maybe not there. The dictionaries, at least one of them says, you know, the reason or reasons one has for acting or behaving in a particular way. So we can think about, what are the reasons why somebody would participate in Kaizen? There are many examples of intrinsic motivation. We do Kaizen because I don't want my bag to be a little bit scuffed up or dirty because I'm setting it on the floor. Intrinsic motivation is a very powerful driver for Kaizen and really helps build this culture of continuous improvement. The dictionary also says this is the general desire or willingness of someone to do something, general willingness to participate in Kaizen. So if this motivation is lacking, or maybe appears to be lacking, then we come to the word motivate, which is a verb. We're taking action. We're trying to create motivation through the different actions that are intended to motivate. So the dictionary again says, you know, you're providing someone with a motive for doing something. And now I think, well, I don't know, is this veering into maybe dangerous territory if we're telling someone they should care or that they should feel motivated? It would be easier for someone to say, well, I don't know, I don't really feel that motivated. But we can do more as leaders than just telling people that they should participate. The other dictionary definition talks about stimulating someone's interest or enthusiasm for doing something. I think, well, that might be a little bit more constructive approach. Instead of just telling someone they should be motivated, let's do some things to develop or strengthen the motivation that's already there. And some of that language I'm using comes from a methodology you might have heard of in one of our recent webinars back in September about an approach called motivational interviewing. So if you didn't see it, I'll encourage you to go back into the webinar library. Mark Valenti gave this presentation talking about how leaders can strengthen people's motivation. We interview people, we draw out the motivations they already have so that we can get people from ambivalence about participating in continuous improvement, for example, to actually taking action. So again, highly recommend that webinar. So when we talk about motivation, motivating people, there's this really common expression we talk about, or people talk about, the carrot and the stick, or sometimes you hear the carrot or the stick. And the implication is that, the carrot is motivation. I mean, I guess you've got to like carrots for that to be motivating. Or the stick, and the implication is that the stick is used to threaten people or to hit people, which doesn't seem like that's not lean thinking. That's not respectful. That's not what we should have in a modern workplace. But there's sort of a common misunderstanding about this old expression, because it was not the carrot or the stick. The original expression is the carrot and the stick. They're meant to be used together, and the stick is actually used to dangle the carrot. So the stick is actually just sort of part of how we facilitate this supposed incentive or motivation. And my crude drawing coming up next might not exactly illustrate how it was used, but the intent of the carrot and the stick, the origin of this was used to help coax donkeys into moving forward to try to get this carrot. So now if we think to the workplace, I'm like, well, we shouldn't think of our employees or our coworkers as donkeys. We think of, back to the carrot or the stick. Good luck hitting a donkey with a stick. I mean, I've never tried this. I've never ridden a donkey, but people say if you hit a donkey with a stick, it just gets angry, it gets scared, it stops. That hitting a donkey with a stick doesn't do anything to drive it forward. This promise of a carrot might do something. And a friend of mine pointed out once, well, kind of the cruel thing here is that maybe the donkey doesn't ever get the carrot. So, we have some of these crude models of, supposed motivation. If we just dangle a carrot in front of employees, then they will participate in Kaizen. So I don't know if that's really the only possible countermeasure if we think of carrots or money or other incentives. But these different attempts to motivate, these are different countermeasures. John Shook from the Lean Enterprise Institute, formerly of Toyota, asked a great question. Well, what problem are we trying to solve? If we think we're having to motivate or incentivize people, do we really understand the current state? Do we understand something close to a root cause? What's the problem? And so at a high level, people might say, well, the problem is there's not enough improvement taking place. We need better results as a business. Well, instead of blaming people, we could ask why. Why aren't we getting enough improvement? It could be, well, is the problem that people aren't speaking up? Is it that people aren't improving? Is the problem, that they're not documenting what they've done? But, all these sort of attempts at looking at causes, really, to me, when we're focused on the people, it starts sounding like blame. And again, in lean thinking, we're not supposed to be blaming individuals. We're supposed to be looking at systems and our environment and our culture, and we should be asking why. Why is there a lack of participation? Why is there a lack of motivation? Or why is there the appearance of a lack of motivation? Is that the problem? Or is it a lack of confidence that people have, where they have ideas, they'd like to participate, but maybe they're afraid that their ideas aren't good. Maybe they have a lack of confidence that their idea will be well received. So a lot of this, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, starts pointing back to leaders and organizational culture as a root for a lack of participation, a lack of motivation, a lack of confidence, a lack of improvement. So there's an article from HBR and their Working Knowledge publication. I think you can find this freely online, an article from 2006. The headline here, why your employees are losing motivation. And there's an assumption here that they had motivation to begin with. But I think this is true. Like if we're hiring people who don't have motivation or enthusiasm on the day they walk in the door, maybe that points to a problem in our hiring process. So I think people generally do show up on their first day of work, or especially on the first day of their career, they want to make a difference. They have motivation, they want to accomplish something. But as this HBR article says, most companies have it all wrong. They don't have to motivate their employees, they have to stop demotivating them. And I think it's a really powerful idea. And I forget if this article cited one of my biggest influences, Dr. Deming, W. Edwards Deming. In his book, Out of the Crisis, and in his other work, Dr. Deming basically wrote these same things in the 1980s, and I'm sure he had been saying it for decades before that. Dr. Deming said, one is born with intrinsic motivation, self-esteem, dignity, cooperation, curiosity, a joy in learning. And then he adds, these attributes are high at the beginning of life, not just the beginning of our careers, but are gradually crushed by the forces of destruction. Like, well, here's some colorful language, like he's getting all Game of Thrones on us or something. I don't know, I've never watched Game of Thrones, but that seems like the type of show, or, it's like this imagery of like, the forces of destruction. That sounds like a powerful force that we're up against, but this is not some force we have nothing to do about. These forces of destruction are created in organizations, or there's a long history of it. So as Dr. Deming outlines in his book, he lists a number of forces of destruction. Some of this starts in school. There are different studies that show creativity and enthusiasm of kids starts going down dramatically when they start being assigned letter grades or numerical grades. In kindergarten, at least back in the day, maybe this has changed, but kids are there to learn and to grow. And then as soon as they start getting grades, you see marked differences in their creativity and their enthusiasm. Dr. Deming talked about, merit systems, but he also talked about, and I think these are the key things related to motivation, whether it's Kaizen or other participation, incentive pay, or numerical goals without a method. So an example of this might be telling everyone, you've got to implement 10 Kaizen ideas this year, without having a method, without having leadership support, without having culture that supports that. So Deming said, these forces, they crush out joy in learning, joy on the job and innovation. Extrinsic motivation gradually replaces intrinsic motivation, self-esteem, and dignity. So this is one of the risks that happens when we start paying people to do something they might otherwise feel naturally inspired to do. The focus now turns to the incentive, and if the incentive got cut or goes away, people might now say, oh, forget it, I'm not participating anymore. Where if we had been able to rely on and build upon and draw out intrinsic motivation, joy in work or pride in work, we wouldn't risk that going away if the company stopped offering the extrinsic motivation. So even a more modern view of this same idea comes from Daniel Pink's outstanding book Drive, where he talks about incentives and extrinsic motivation, and he says, well, extrinsic motivation works. The problem with it, though, is the side effects. And so one of the dangers, as he talks about in his book, is that, again, extrinsic motivation replaces intrinsic motivation, and that those extrinsic motivations aren't as strong. Or I've seen cases where, at some point, let's say if you're offering $5 for Kaizen, well, people get very used to that, and then maybe $5 isn't motivating. So now management says, well, maybe we should offer 10. And now that might spiral out of control or be unsustainable. But if you'd like to learn more about that, I recommend his book Drive, or I did a podcast with Dan back in 2010. You can find that also through my blog or through different podcast feeds. There's a different study that was published that says, when we think about sort of crushing intrinsic motivation, in 85% of companies, employees' morale sharply declines after their first 6 months and continues to deteriorate for years afterward. So this is a study from 15, 20 years ago. I don't know if things have really changed or gotten better since then. But Dr. Deming, again, talked about this in Out of the Crisis, where he illustrated it in a very similar way, that you'd say at the beginning of our lives or the beginning of our careers. Unfortunately, the things that happen to people in the workplace usually do nothing but demotivate people over time. So if people ask, well, what should we do to motivate people? Again, there's that sort of opposite question brought up in these different books and different studies that says, well, what should we stop doing? Should we stop doing the things that demotivate people in ways that are often quite harmful or quite sad? So there's often this focus on rewards and recognition, and to borrow an old political campaign phrase, we might say, it's the behavior, stupid. And well, I don't like that expression because, don't want to call people stupid. But so instead of the old saying, it's the economy, stupid, we'll strike economy, we'll strike stupid and say, well, it's about behaviors. It's about leadership behaviors. As Dr. Deming said, in a lot of cases, what we need to do is substitute leadership. We can eliminate incentives, quotas, targets, and what do we do instead? We can substitute leadership, the right kinds of leader behaviors that, again, draw out people's intrinsic motivations to improve their own work, to improve things for patients and healthcare, to improve things for the organization, because hopefully they view that all as being a win-win. If I help the organization do well, I will also do well. We are looking at an example, one of my favorite books. This is a lean novel, a business novel, Andy and Me and the Hospital. Great book by my friend, and I would call Pascal a sensei of mine, Pascal Dennis, who worked for Toyota in Canada for a long time. In his book, he talks about leader behaviors for strategy deployment, or we could call these leader behaviors for creating a culture of continuous improvement. It starts off with defining purpose clearly, identifying the biggest obstacles and maybe the things that require the biggest types of improvements. But not all improvements need to be big. When we talk about Kaizen and continuous improvement, that starts with small improvements. And as Pascal said, leaders need to, I think this is the key point here, create an atmosphere conducive to initiative and creativity. So instead of blaming people for not taking an initiative or blaming them for not being creative, we need to sometimes look in the mirror or look at the organizational culture and ask what's stifling people, what's demotivating them. And then the fourth, I think this also applies, the fourth thing on Pascal's list is reduce hassle. If the continuous improvement process is too much of a hassle, that might be the barrier or the reason why people don't participate. So again, if we think about rewards and recognition, I think lean thinking would prompt us to ask, well, instead of jumping to countermeasures, ask, well, these are a countermeasure to what problem? And again, a lot of times in the balance of rewards and recognition, rewards really dominates. Incentives, bonuses, offering raises, that your pay increase may be partly driven by your participation in continuous improvement. I've seen organizations do that. Organizations set targets or quotas. But rewards sound great. But again, as Dan Pink said, the problem is they often get dysfunctional. If we look at what happened in just 3 cases here, the Veterans Health Administration had a scandal where all across the country there were incentives or threats kind of dangled in front of clinic managers. Said, well, if the patient waiting times are too long, you're going to be punished. And so this led to all sorts of dysfunction, gaming of the system, fudging of the numbers. Patients were being put on unofficial waiting lists to get on the waiting list. There were all kinds of understandable things that happened that were being driven by the system. The Office of the Inspector General, or one of these, or maybe it was Office of Management and Budget, one of these kind of government oversight groups, that then the government said the waiting time targets were, quote, unrealistic. And so when we give people an unrealistic target and then we offer rewards or threaten punishment, that often leads to a lot of really dysfunctional things. In the British National Health Service, they've had long-standing targets around the idea that no patient should wait more than 4 hours in accident and emergency. And that leads to all sorts of dysfunctional behavior, including admitting patients unnecessarily, because then the clock stops ticking and now they didn't wait more than 4 hours, but now they're clogging up an inpatient bed, which does what? It lengthens waiting time for other patients. And I saw an article earlier this year that said the NHS is thinking about eliminating the target because most hospitals or a lot of hospitals weren't hitting the target, even after the target and rewards and threats being in place for a very long time. And I think they were also recognizing that the target alone wasn't really driving improvement. Third case, the Wells Fargo scandal, where the CEO set a target. I think the target was 8 accounts per customer, because 8 is great, like literally like just because of a rhyme. And that 8 number turned out to be unrealistic, and managers and bankers started opening up accounts without permission. And Wells Fargo, I mean, the CEO eventually got pushed out, but thousands of people got fired for quote unquote acting unethically, when arguably this is all driven by these systemic factors, and there's a lot of tragedy about how this has affected people's careers. So there's that caution, is that rewards sound like they make sense, they might work in the short term, but they might cause different problems. So when people ask about paying for ideas, paying for implemented ideas, on the pro side, it seems motivating. It might get attention and participation from some people who might not have participated naturally. And then it also seems fair to share savings. This is definitely part of the dynamic of old suggestion box systems. But the disadvantages can be things like, well, it can discourage teamwork. Like if we're paying the person or one person with an idea, this was definitely a trap of suggestion box systems. It really hurts the team environment. If we're trying to share savings, it quickly seems unfair if we can't agree on the value of an idea. We end up arguing about, the employee might be incentivized or is being incentivized to overinflate the value of the idea, and management might want to say no, it really wasn't worth that much. It can take the focus off improvement. It requires a bureaucracy to manage. It can harm creativity. But when we try to flip the balance and maybe talk about recognition and rewards, where again rewards might be like points toward different rewards, cash, time off, shared savings, drawings, performance appraisals. Recognition might include things like thank yous, smiles, handshakes. I mean, last I checked, those are all free. They're easy to give if we're willing to as leaders. We can give public recognition. Now, some people get embarrassed by this and they don't want to be recognized in front of their team. They'd rather have kind of a private handshake or a fist bump or a private thank you, good job, pat on the back. Sharing improvements across the organization is a great way to give recognition. Maybe having an annual awards ceremony, not just to choose the idea. I think I would be afraid that choosing like, oh, here's the award for the biggest cost-saving idea, that might get dysfunctional. But we could give awards to a lot of people for creative Kaizens or Kaizens that made a difference in different ways. At the St. Francis Health System in Indianapolis, where my co-author Joe Schwartz works, they really emphasize recognition. They have a point system where people can earn cups of coffee and logo merchandise. But one of the things, and you see here in this picture of Andy, who works in endoscopy, you see she has a badge holder clip that celebrates that she's a Kaizen star and that she has implemented 200 ideas. And people there at Franciscan really do take note. If someone's got one of these Kaizen stars that has a 25 or a 50 or a 100, I mean, you can do virtual badges like this in the KaiNexus system if you're a KaiNexus customer. Things like this can really do more to emphasize improvement than cash payments might. So, if we do want to pay for ideas, I think some of the things that are proven to work, or at least are less dysfunctional, is small payments. At Franciscan, sort of like that one manufacturing company in Japan, they give small, even payments for any idea. It's based on implementation of the idea, of course, and it includes all who participated. So if 5 people are listed on a Kaizen summary, all 5 of them will get that 100 yen, or 5 of them at Franciscan will get the points that are worth, probably about $2 each in the cafeteria. Now, if somebody really does have occasionally an idea that's a multi-million-dollar cost savings, organizations usually have some sort of process for giving special recognition and a special bonus if they deem that appropriate. If we're setting goals, I think we have to be careful that it's a goal that expresses a belief in people. I believe everyone can come up with 4 ideas this year. But there's a risk that that goal is a quota where at the end of the year, people race around. This is probably happening here in December in some organizations. They're racing around saying, oh, I've got to get my 4. Well, they might come up with superficial ideas or ideas that aren't really that meaningful. But then there's also the risk that a goal of 4 becomes a limit, where people say, okay, well, I've already got my 4 submitted. I've got 2, but I'm not going to submit them yet because maybe next year they're going to raise the goal to 8. And I don't know if I can come up with 8, so I'm going to hold these back and apply them toward next year. So that's a little bit of dysfunction. And if we set goals, I think, again, it's important if we're not hitting those goals to ask why, or we could ask, like they do at Franciscan, how might we? How might we improve the system that in a way that drives participation? And I think it comes down to leader behaviors of enthusiasm and recognition and coaching and support. As Dr. Deming, again, would say, substitute leadership. That the right behaviors lead to employee participation. And we've done a lot of webinars in the past. I've done them. Greg Jacobson has done them with me. Other presenters have talked about these behaviors that help drive improvements. That's why I'm not really giving a huge laundry list of what those behaviors are. But when you have that right environment, and a lot of our KaiNexus customers do, as this article in CAP Today a few years ago pointed out, KaiNexus clients on average implement more than 80% of the ideas that are submitted. That's really good. Suggestion box systems classically only implemented 2 to 3% of ideas because, again, suggestion boxes were generally looking for big, huge ideas, where Kaizen, again, usually starts with the small ideas. And as people build capabilities and confidence, they're going to start implementing bigger, they're going to start solving bigger problems, maybe with bigger countermeasures. But I think one of the lessons and one of the things I've seen in different settings is that if you don't get participation, there's no hope for alignment. So one of the classic lessons, going back to Masaki Imai in his book Kaizen, is to say at the beginning phases of building a culture of continuous improvement, you basically just want to encourage people to implement anything that matters to them, solving problems that matter to them. Don't worry too much about alignment to organizational goals. This is another common question I get. It's like, well, does every Kaizen idea need to align with True North? And generally I would say, well, no. I mean, they don't all need to. So let's unpack this idea a little bit. Because I think, if you get participation, you can then aim for alignment. I think the risk is when people push too hard on alignment, if the alignment focus is too heavy, then I think we find participation ends up being too light. One of the dysfunctions here might be that management is asking only for improvements with financial benefit because they're really trying to align to financial goals. Employees, honestly, in a lot of cases, might not care about that. So if you let people work on things that matter to them, classic Kaizen advice in terms of making your work easier, improving safety, improving quality, if we keep things in balance, the right level of alignment, I think we tend to get more participation. So if we're looking for alignment, there's alignment in what we're measuring through the practice of strategy deployment, if you're using that within the context of Lean. And we're also looking for the right level of alignment in our improvement activities. So if we look at, this is kind of a classic Toyota diagram that what you see here is modified from something that was in the book, the Toyota Way Field Book. This is from Franciscan St. Francis Health. You talk about roughly 3 types or 3 levels of Kaizen. You've got the large Kaizen, the high complexity expensive, big projects, big countermeasures that are intended to address big challenges. Then you've got the middle level, which might be lean events, Six Sigma projects, A3s. And then you've got the bottom level that you might call daily Kaizen, all of the small little improvements. And so what I've seen is that, with the small Kaizens, when that activity is spread out and distributed throughout the organization, we don't really have to worry about alignment. Because again, I think in a successful Kaizen or continuous improvement culture, people are testing and implementing and evaluating their own ideas. This all shouldn't fall, it can't fall on leaders or continuous improvement specialists. So again, I would say, small Kaizen doesn't require too much alignment. It's the large Kaizen that now might consume a lot of resources, and there might be conflicts over scarce organizational resources. Then alignment might matter more. So if we're trying to align measures, kind of classic framework in Lean is to look at things like safety, quality, cost, and morale. We have people who use KaiNexus to align their True North dashboard in terms of these categories and their metrics and their activities to try to look and see, they're trying to get a balance of improvement that's not just focused directly on cost, but again, focusing on things that matter like safety. Now, alignment doesn't necessarily mean that everybody measures the exact same thing. I'll give you a healthcare example where, if we're looking at safety and when we look at a health system, we're going to have a mix of inpatient care, outpatient care, emergency department. And we might start off by saying, well, all the inpatient units are going to measure patient falls as a contributor to patient harm, which might be the high-level metric for the organization. And the outpatient clinics might be measuring employee sprains and strains because patient falls might not really be a big concern in the outpatient clinic setting. But there was one organization I visited where, thankfully, because they had, they practiced catchball, they had feedback from their employees. Somebody in the labor and delivery unit pointed out and said, I don't think patient falls is really the right thing for us to be measuring because mothers, we don't have problems with that. And I think that shows a really, that's a positive sign that people felt free to speak up. If they just kept their mouth shut and were being measured on patient falls and they felt like, well, that's pretty easy to get a 0 in that measure, they could have taken, if you will, the easy A. But they spoke up and said, I forget what they measured, but they said, there's something that's a more important measure for us in labor delivery. So they were working toward alignment, which then helps align these different departments to the activities that they should be initiating to affect the measure that matters. So choosing the right measure that's not identical but aligned, I think then helps help drive or help align the improvement activity that could be taking place in that department. So again, I think we do need to prioritize the large things. Someone else I really admire and would consider a mentor, Dr. John Toussaint, always emphasizes the idea of what are the must-do, can't-fail initiatives for our organization. And this is a picture he shared, and I've gone through similar exercises in different health systems of saying, if we have the executive team brainstorm all of the supposed top priority initiatives, you might have 300 of those for the organization. And at that point, there's a lack of focus. If everything is a top priority, nothing is a top priority. And we tend not to accomplish as much as if we helped create focus and alignment. So as Dr. Toussaint talks about, and as he practices as a leader, at some point you're deselecting ideas. It doesn't mean, no, we're not going to do it, but we're going to say, no, not right now. And again, we have people within the KaiNexus platform deferring different improvement ideas as a different form of saying, not rejected, not a bad idea, just not right now. So again, back to this illustration where I think we do need to prioritize and try to get alignment around large Kaizen. Don't need to do so as much when we get to the smaller Kaizen part of that scale. So a few final thoughts to wrap up here. Back to this common question. Should we give incentives or rewards for participation in Kaizen? I think after some conversation or even after some experience, the question changes a little bit where people might ask, well, do we have to give incentives or rewards for participation in Kaizen? Yes, no, maybe. How do we give incentives? What types of rewards? I think there's nuance here. Do we have to? No. Can we? Sure. I think that's for you to decide based on your organization, your culture, your organization's history and expectations. Not every organization is the same. Or I would encourage you to go through your own organizational plan, do, study, adjust cycles. Try something and see what works. At Franciscan, they have experimented with different drawings and different other incentives and rewards, and through their own practice at PDSA, they've actually kind of backed off on some of those reward programs, and they've done more to focus on leader behaviors and coaching leaders so that they do things that help people's intrinsic motivation come out and shine. So I'm an engineer. I'm not the most literary person in the world, but I remember in high school I had to study. See, it sounded like this. I was forced to. Maybe I didn't have intrinsic motivation to study Emerson, but as Emerson said, moderation in all things. And I think some of that applies to what we might try to do with incentives and different attempts to motivate others. We might want to think about not taking things too far and looking for a sweet spot where maybe extrinsic motivation is helpful, but let's not do it in a way that completely crushes intrinsic motivation. Going back further in time, I don't remember if I ever read The Odyssey by Homer, but he said, I think he's the origin of this quote you hear a lot, sort of this Zen idea of, in all things, balance is better. So how do we balance our urge or our habit of trying to drive participation through extrinsic motivation? How can we balance that maybe with better, more successful attempts to draw out and build upon intrinsic motivation? I think I've shared some thoughts and viewpoints and opinions on this. I'm not saying my way is the only way. I'm curious to hear what feedback you have through the Q&A session or beyond. We'll share email addresses here at the end. I encourage you to reach out if you want to talk about any of this or share any of your experiences. And look, here's a defect. There's a random hashtag here because the talk I'm giving today is sort of an evolution of a talk I first gave at the KaiNexus user conference. So I'll use that as an opportunity to plug KaiNexicon 2020. If you're a KaiNexus customer, I hope you'll join us. So with that, Clint, I will take a bit of a breath here and hand things over to you for announcements and then Q&A.
Fantastic, fantastic. Excellent presentation, Mark, as always. Thank you for taking the time to put everything together and spend the time with us today. We do have a few questions. Before we get to them, we'll just go through a couple announcements. Upcoming webinars from the KaiNexus and KaiNexus team. We are hosting training team office hours, December 19th from 1 to 1:30 Eastern time. Mark and Greg will be hosting an Ask Us Anything, episode number 26, January 17th from 1 to 1:30 Eastern. You can always check out our on-demand webinar library on the KaiNexus website. We would encourage
Let me just, I'm sorry, I was just going to jump in and say I should have put the URL on here, but it's kainexus.com/webinars. And I am working on lining up the 2020 webinar presenters. So we'll continue this as a monthly series, again, of course, next year.
Of course, we want to encourage everyone to follow the KaiNexus blog. That is blog.kainexus.com. It's a great way to start your day. We'll deliver our blog post right to your inbox. And then lastly, you can always check out the KaiNexus podcast at www.kainexus.com/podcasts. You can subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or whatever it is the kids are listening to podcasts. So, Mark, we do have a couple questions, and we've got about 15 minutes here. So, if there's anybody else in the audience that has additional questions, please drop those into the questions section of the GoToWebinar window. We'll try to get to all of them before we run out of time. First, Mark, just kind of curious. You talked about not focusing on motivating employees, but instead focusing on not demotivating people. And one of the things you also talked about was just the need to make it easy for people to participate in things, because the focus should be on participation first and then alignment second. I was hoping you could just talk a little bit more about the importance of making it easy to participate, and maybe give us some examples of processes you've seen that were easy and maybe some you've seen that were not so easy.
Yeah, so I mean, I think especially for small Kaizen ideas, small ideas to address relatively small problems, that's where we really have to make it easy, not create too much bureaucracy or too much structure. At Toyota, as I talked about in that blog post from 2014, I asked the tour guide, so what happens if you have an idea? And what she said was so simple. And, she said, well, if I have an idea, I talk to my supervisor, and usually the supervisor approves it. I'm like, well, there you go. Because I think Toyota is said to have, or at least their goal is 90% implementation rates. And, I think there is a little bit more depth and complexity to, if the manager thinks, well, that idea is not realistic for some reason, then you need to talk about it. And part of the leadership behaviors that help create a culture of continuous improvement is that instead of rejecting ideas, that quote unquote bad idea is the starting point for discussion, coaching, conversation, brainstorming. If somebody suggests something that's not practical, too expensive, too slow, that's one of the leader behaviors that helps keep people engaged. So, continue, I guess, on the path of making it easy. At Franciscan, they generally document completed Kaizens. So they do, like we're in those binders at the factory in Japan, kind of a single page summary that shows the before, the after, the impact, who was involved. They have pictures. They're keeping the documentation simple. They're making it easy, whether those are handwritten forms, a PowerPoint template, or I think one of the things people say about KaiNexus is that we keep it simple and keep it easy for those who are using our platform to submit new ideas, to work on them, to document things that have already been done. So I think one example of where things get too complex, I've heard people give feedback at a number of organizations I've visited where leaders were trying to make everything into an A3. The last manufacturing company I worked at, they were trying to make everything a Kaizen event. So I think in both those cases, it runs the risk of not making it easy, of making it too difficult. And a lot of times people find the A3 template as comfortable as I am with it, as comfortable as others in our audience might be today. That's intimidating to some. And I think if they're scared off by the A3 or they're not getting enough coaching, then people might just say, okay, fine, it's too difficult, I'm not going to participate. I think that goes back to the argument that says, you've got to start small, let people start with small improvements, they build capability and confidence, and then they can work their way up to saying, well, this little problem is too complicated. Then you can introduce the idea of A3 problem solving as needed. I think of in healthcare, there's a parallel process around incident reporting, where if there's a near miss or if there's harm to a patient, we hear complaints all the time of people saying, oh, these incident reporting systems are so time consuming and the software is so difficult to use. It's almost, like some people even cynically say, it's almost like it's intentionally designed to discourage reporting. I don't know if I believe that. It might be inadvertent. But that's one reason why, bringing it back to KaiNexus customers asked us to build an incident reporting module that was simpler and easier so that people would actually use it. So, I think those, making it easy, back to the question, and then I'll stop rambling. I'm blaming jet lag for this. I ramble sometimes anyway without jet lag. But making it easy is one of those things that I think one of the forces of destruction might be making it too complicated, where making it easy allows people to carry forward with that intrinsic motivation instead of squashing it.
Great. We do have a couple more questions here. One is, if we already have a reward system in place, do you have any advice for transitioning away from that into a more recognition-based system?
That's a good question, because and that's where I was trying to, at least at the end, to be a little bit less strident and dogmatic than I might have sounded earlier, because like I said, every organization has a history where people maybe have been conditioned to expect intrinsic motivation. So trying to go cold turkey on the extrinsic motivation might cause an uproar. So one thought that comes to mind is maybe in parallel start doing more on the recognition side of the equation. And then maybe once that's in place, it's possible to kind of scale back the extrinsic motivation. I'm sorry, what was that, Clint?
No, I was just going to say it sounds like that could be a bit of a tricky situation, because what you're saying is if you just pull that off the table, you might have the adverse effects, right? It's kind of the hey, we're trying to do something good, but no good deed goes unpunished, right? That kind of sounds like what you're saying a little bit.
Yeah, I just think of different situations where I think of like in a lot of organizations, salespeople are working on a very pay-for-performance incentive, target quota-driven system. There are some organizations that do not operate that way, and they basically pay a salary and a fair salary, and there might be profit sharing or team-based bonuses or incentive comp. But I could see if an organization has this culture of individual quotas and incentives, that's maybe attracted people who feel driven by that, and trying to transition too quickly might cause problems. Maybe it's like we were talking, Clint and I were chatting about college football before we started the webinar, and like maybe Georgia Tech is a football team that struggles, where they for the longest time used this triple option run-based offense, like they never threw the ball, and that means recruiting certain sized offensive linemen and certain types of players, and it's hard to recruit quarterbacks and wide receivers. Well, then they brought in a new coach, and I think I have this right, where they tried putting in a totally different type of offense. But then the problem is it's college football. You can't replace all of your players overnight like an NFL team did. So I think there's certainly been some growing pains and struggle that they're going through until they can start recruiting players that better fit that new system. So I don't know if there's a good parallel back to continuous improvement incentives. I'm rambling again, but I mean, Clint, do you have any thoughts on this from your different experiences, not just with sales, but what you hear from KaiNexus customers?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I always kind of draw back to my experience and how a salesperson is motivated, and the differences between that at KaiNexus versus that elsewhere. I know for me, right, I certainly find more value in being recognized for good work and hard work versus being financially rewarded for selling a big customer, right? I mean that's a personal thing for me, though I can't imagine I'm that much different than a whole lot of other people. That's kind of what I always go back to. And I know you and I have had this conversation at least at times.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I mean, money matters. We all need to make a living, and people want to get fair, competitive pay. But, there's just different ways of structuring that fair and competitive pay.
Indeed. So got a couple more questions. I got about 5 minutes here. Hi, Mark. What is meant by, quote, explanation of variances, close quote, re forces of destruction? This sounds like,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
But it sounds like what? I think you have the answer here.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
this sounds like reason coding as part of breaking down a problem. Is it something else?
Yeah, I think it ties more into the types of things I wrote about in measures of success. And there's a couple of webinars I've done on this topic in the webinar library, where basically asking people to explain or come up with a root cause for noise in a metric, or rewarding people for above average performance and then punishing them for below average performance when performance is just fluctuating within a range. So that was one of the topics Deming really emphasized, and he said leaders need to understand variation and respond appropriately to variation, and that's, I think, what's meant by that phrase.
So, what are some common starting points when initiating Kaizen or continuous improvement initiatives in a company that operates in a traditional management style and has minimal employee engagement due to the quote, historic, close quote, non-responsiveness of the management team?
Yeah. At the risk of sounding glib, it's got to start somewhere with somebody. I think it comes back to leader behaviors, and it could be that there's a executive change. Like when I was at General Motors in the mid '90s, I worked under two plant managers in this plant of 800 people. The first plant manager was a completely traditional management by yelling and screaming, blaming the employees, not engaging the employees type of leader. And then we got a new plant manager who was one of the GM people who got to work with Toyota at the NUMMI plant. And he came in with a totally different mindset. And so, sometimes at the executive level, a leader who has different beliefs and articulates these beliefs can help move the needle on the organization. Sometimes it's just a manager within their team who comes in and says, I'm going to start engaging people. I'm going to start building trust. I'm going to express my belief that they can do something to solve problems and participate. That doesn't mean that everyone is going to immediately jump to it unless it's a particularly charismatic leader, maybe. There's the logic, and then there's the emotion of all of this. There's the art of leadership. But if you get some people in that department who are willing to start, that can get the ball rolling. If you have a team of 20 people, let's say 4 or 5 of them are eager and willing and intrinsically motivated, and they say, finally, someone's asking, I'm going to participate in Kaizen. There might be that middle part of the bell curve within the team that's kind of waiting to see, I don't know if this is really going to be good. And then when they see those initial people being recognized and good things starting to happen, then more people might start participating. And then there might be some who were maybe just too damaged by the historical system to ever be willing to participate. But, again, I would think of those as system problems. And, it comes back to the question of how do we stop demotivating the next generation of employees who come in. But I haven't seen a situation where a leader asks a department to participate and absolutely nobody steps forward. I think there's a lot of kind of untapped potential in organizations of people who have ideas and they're just waiting to be engaged.
So we do have one more question. Probably got about 20 seconds left. Do you want to try to get through it?
We can go a little over. I mean, if people have to drop off, it's fine. But
we'll go a little over. No big deal. So my team recently visited the Toyota forklift factory in Columbus, Indiana. During the tour, the brand ambassador stated that they didn't like seeing green when it comes to improvement metrics, i.e. hitting the goal. They'd rather see red, i.e. not hitting the mark, but seeing improvement. He went on to say that if you hit green, you set the bar too low. Thoughts on how to motivate folks to improve if they can never hit the goal?
Well, so I think some of it comes down to how do leaders respond when the metric is red, right? So I know former Toyota people who talk about creating a gap. So let's say there might be an initial performance level that's fairly low, and there's there's a target that's not being met. Maybe it's a customer requirement. So the metric's in the red, and so we're driven to improve. And so then you exceed the goal, but you're not perfect. And this is where I think the continuous pursuit of perfection kicks in, to where now, if a leader communicates with the team and celebrates, okay, we hit the goal, that's great, we're going to celebrate, but now we're going to raise the bar. And I think if this is being done in a sort of positive, we're all in this together kind of frame of mind, I don't think that's a huge problem. If red means blaming the employees, kind of like back to that old traditional culture I suffered through in my first year at General Motors, well then, yeah, that would be really discouraging. I've seen times where there's sort of a balance where, when a team is improved and is exceeding a goal, like you've got to have a bit of a celebration period, and allow the team to sort of, maybe bask in that a little bit before saying, okay, and now we need to do better. Like if a leader rushes into that and says, okay, team, way to go, well, now we're raising the goal, that might irritate people, right? So, so I think it's interesting to hear Toyota say that red is not bad. It just means there's a gap. That gap is the definition of a problem. And again, in that culture, there's no shame in the word problem or the idea of a problem, because the Toyota philosophy talks about mutual trust, mutual respect, and I think a lot of that, when it exists, is a really powerful force. So the challenge is, what if our organization does not? Like when I was at General Motors, there was not mutual trust, there was not mutual respect. That new plant manager that I worked under spent months out in the shop floor talking to people, mostly listening, trying to build that sense of mutual trust and respect. But yeah, in a lot of organizations, those three examples I used, being red meant you were maybe going to lose your job or not get promoted, so people fudged the numbers to make things look green. So I think it just goes to show how the culture and environment and the leadership behaviors really make the difference.
So we do have one more. I think this one might tie a little bit into our previous question about companies operating in a traditional management style and trying to get people on board with something new. What are good examples or best practices that companies are using to create an understanding of the intent and in the consistent execution of a reward and recognition system, to align existing leadership with new leadership or new thoughts that are coming into an organization?
Let's see. There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm going to again blame jet lag. Can you paraphrase or summarize that for me, Clint?
Yeah, so let's kind of take this piece by piece. So first, like, what's a good way to get everyone just to understand why we're putting in a reward or recognition system? Let's start with that piece of the question. Like, what are some good ways people communicate that? How do you make sure that people understand that this is a positive thing and that we're trying to get participation through a reward or recognition system?
Well, so, I mean, that's a different question. I mean, part of me wants to answer a slightly different question of communicating about why we're trying to create a culture of continuous improvement. Because again, like, the reward and recognition system, we can try to tell people this is positive, but if they don't view it as positive, you could go through a lot of conversation, and I think that it requires more effort than just kind of putting out an announcement or a leader giving one speech or putting out one company-wide email. I mean, I think any sort of organizational change, and this, I think, ties back to the lessons from motivational interviewing, that say, change and acceptance of change is a process. It takes time. It's not like flipping a light switch. So motivational interviewing talks about conversations about change. And I think there's a really important notion there, whether we're trying to help people build their motivation around participating in improvement. If we're trying to have a conversation about rewards and recognition system, and people are being quote unquote resistant, and that's a very loaded word. I think we need to understand what people's concerns are. And it's not just a process of, well, let me convince them, but having a conversation where, you might listen to their concerns, and then you might decide, well, no, maybe reward and recognition system isn't the right thing to do. So I think, that's a couple of thoughts on that at least. And then what was the other part of that?
So I think the other part was just about, what are some ways or best practices to sustain that type of system? I'm not sure if this is a bit more of a tactical question or not. Hopefully we can get the right answer here. But I think the question is more of, what are people doing after they put that system in place to make sure that it's maintained and that we're executing on it consistently?
I don't know how to answer that for the rewards and recognition, because I don't help people put in reward and recognition systems generally, basically. So, but I think, with anything, the sustainment challenge, a lot of that is set in place in the very early stages, where I think the very beginning conversations with employees about change set the stage for sustainability. I think a lot of times organizations try to shortcut the change process, sort of try to force in a change, and then after the fact, maybe kind of panic and react and say, oh my gosh, we need to figure out how to force sustainability. At some point that might be too late. I think if we've engaged people in change in a way where there's agreement around a problem or an opportunity, and then we build agreement around the changes or the countermeasures, we're getting input from people as part of that plan, do, study, adjust mindset, I think that sets the stage for sustainment. I guess is the thought comes to mind there.
So hopefully that helped answer that last question. We're about 8 minutes over. If we didn't get the answer we needed on that last question, please feel free to reach out to Mark directly via email. We'll make sure that we spend some more time on it. Mark, before we shut her down here, any closing thoughts from you?
Well, I just want to thank people for attending, or thank people for listening to the recording, whichever it is. Again, I was sharing some of my perspectives and drawing on some of the people who have been influential to me, but certainly, happy to hear opposing viewpoints, or if people have examples that show, well, look, sometimes rewards and recognition have been helpful or effective. I'm certainly open to hearing those stories without me turning it into an argument. I'd like to hear people's stories or questions or feedback, and look forward to people sharing that. And I'm looking forward to what we have in store for the 2020 webinars, and I hope people will continue signing up and participating. We appreciate it. We're offering no extrinsic motivation to do so, so we appreciate people's intrinsic motivation to attend.
Yep. I'll echo Mark's sentiments. Thanks everybody for your time. Thanks for your questions and your participation. And we will see you, Kai, next time.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks, y'all.